So I want to first of all welcome Paul to the first edition of History from the Shadows. Now, tell us a bit about yourself and what's your background, Paul?
Well, I was born in London. I've been born and bred in London, and went to a comprehensive school, had a very ordinary education. I spent over 20 years working for the National Health Service, and I've written a book.
Now, the title of your book is Ancestors. Can you tell the audience just a little bit of what it's about? We don't want to give too much away. We just want to get enough for them we want them to buy it from you.
Okay. Ancestors is about a boy who is captured off the west coast of Africa. He's put in chains and taken and put on a slave ship heading for the Caribbean, to the Americas, to Jamaica in fact. And he's disembarked and he's enslaved on a sugar plantation. And Ancestors is about this boy's plight from capture to the abolition of slavery in 1834. Now, the boy in the book is based on my third great-grandfather. That's my great-great-great-grandfather, John Alexander Crooks, and my fourth great-grandmother, Amie Jabba Brown. And she is like a sort of inspirational figure for this boy in the book. She inspires him, encourages him to never lose hope, never lose that will to fight for his freedom.
So was it your grandmother that, in a lot of ways, that memory of her that inspired you to write the book?
Well, what inspired me was in fact my father, and he's a very proud Jamaican, very proud of his roots, very proud of the town that he came from, Black River, which is in St. Elizabeth, Jamaica. And he told me that there were loads of Crookses in Jamaica. And one day I said to him, well, Dad, where does the name Crooks come from? And he said to me that, well, he didn't know because the oral history had been lost somewhere down the line. And so I set out really to find out about the origins of the name Crooks. And what I found was a bit more than expected. I managed to trace my roots all the way back to Africa as a result of 13 years of researching the name Crooks and where it came from.
What was sort of your intentions in writing the book, and do you feel that you achieved everything you wanted to?
Okay, my intentions were manifold. But the key one was, after 13 years of research, I wanted to find a way of sharing everything that I'd found out about tracing my ancestry and about my origins. And I thought about just writing reports and, I don't know, maybe putting it online as the internet became more as a means of communication. But then I decided to write a novel because I thought that writing creatively about what happened to John Alexander Crooks and being able to fill in the gaps and the historical context and write a historical novel was probably the best way to not only share it with my family but also to share it with anybody who wanted to hear my story.
Give us an insight into the main character of the book, your great ancestor.
Okay, so there are two great ancestors involved here. So John Alexander Crooks is perhaps the protagonist, so he's the person that I've based the story around. Now, John Alexander Crooks is this young boy. He's taken from Africa and he has no idea where he's going. And when he ends up in Jamaica, he is seasoned. So he's been given an old lady who's going to look after him, who's going to show him the ropes, who's going to really teach him about life on the plantation. So he's very much in his formative years and just dreaming about returning to Africa. My fourth great-grandmother comes into the story, somebody who's been on the plantation for a while and is a very strong character. The truth about Amie is that they tried to take away her African name, but the slave register showed that she kept on to her name. So I've got her as a very strong character and somebody who this boy, John Alexander Crooks, looks up to, and eventually he plays his role in what becomes the Baptist War and the struggle for freedom.
For you, what was one of the most surprising things that you discovered about your family or slavery in general in writing the book?
One of the surprising things, and you have to bear in mind that when I started, I started on the back of William Wilberforce being the great saviour of Africans in the Caribbean. But that's where I started from. So the big surprise for me was finding out that there are what I call heroes and sheroes of the freedom movements during slavery. So I was surprised to find out about Sam Sharp. I was surprised to find that Sam Sharp was operating in the area that my ancestors were living and working in the western parishes of Jamaica. And I was surprised at how the Baptist, how Christianity played into the whole liberation struggle. That was a surprise to me, and that's what I really wanted to put across in Ancestors, the novel.
What did you edit out of the book that perhaps in hindsight you feel now that you would have liked to have left in?
I don't think I edited out anything. I mean, everything that I wanted to say about the abolition of slavery, every hidden truth, every hidden story is in there. So, and being a historical novel, I had to do that. I think what I sneaked in, which, in terms of when you structure novels, you're probably not really supposed to do, was what William Wilberforce and the abolition movement was thinking whilst John Alexander Crooks and Ami were thinking about liberation struggles. So I managed to sort of get that into the book. Because I really didn't want to leave anything out that had a bearing on the abolition of slavery and all the key influences there.
Yeah. I mean, having done all this research, and I'm sure you would have come across the horrors of the transatlantic slave industry, the Middle Passage, the plantation. So as a descendant from those people you was writing about, for you, what was the most emotional scene in the book that really wrenched at your heart when you wrote it?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I mean, the book is sort of divided up into phases. The boy's arrival, and there's a scene in the book, if you like, called a scramble when plantation owners, let's say the slave masters were buying slaves, and it was a massive scramble. And just writing that was quite emotional. But I think the bit that really made me emotional and was a bit where the protagonist, John Alexander Crooks, is having a conversation with his minister, who's of the Anglican faith, and he's torn between this idea of being a good Christian and I guess the passive nature that goes with that, and wanting to join a liberation struggle at the same time. And as I said, religion plays into the struggle. And so there's a scene where he's talking to his minister about the Bible and what the Bible says about things. And of course his minister has no answer to the questions that he's asking. And so just writing that whole passage in the book was quite, for me it was quite a turning point in terms of the way I viewed slavery, because I was thinking, well, this is how I would be thinking, and my emotions really came to the fore in that.
Now, in this monumental work, I'm sure there was a lot of research that went into it. So how did you go about researching this such a brilliant book?
Okay, well, it's a short question but a long answer. But what I did first and foremost was I started talking to the elders in my family. So my father, my grandfather, my father and my aunts and friends of the family. And when I amassed enough information from the oral history, I then turned to the public records. Now, when I started researching, it wasn't known at all that public records could actually help you trace back. I mean, it's since Ancestors was published that everybody sort of heard about the slave registers, heard about the Latter-day Saints, and it's common knowledge now. So the process was oral history, and then searching for the sources, the public records, and then on to visiting the plantation that was, and then visiting Africa and my extended family in Africa.
And that sort of brings us into the next question. Can tell us about the book that followed on from Ancestors, because it's sort of you putting down that journey of discovery and research, and in a way helping others to go about it.
Absolutely. I was touring the UK promoting my book quite a while ago, and my publishers asked me, they said, well, we've been along to a few of your talks, and everybody keeps asking questions about how do you do this? And what I realised at the time was that nobody had written the guide, the perfect guide to researching your roots. My second book, A Tree Without Roots, which is the guide to tracing British, African and Asian Caribbean ancestry, is exactly that. And what I do is I use myself as a case study for anybody, and it doesn't matter what your background, anybody who's researching back needs to follow these steps.
Sort of like looking at some of the books that perhaps you would have read and come across, I mean, could you name the books that like had an impact on you, like researching into this topic that was written by other authors and researchers?
Right. The main book for me, the number one, was a book by Richard Hart. Now, Richard Hart was one of the 4 H's that was expelled from Jamaica because, I guess, of his communist beliefs. But Richard Hart wrote a book called The Slaves Who Abolished Slavery. And there were 2 volumes. There was one which is basically about how the Brits were thinking, what they were doing at the time, and then what follows from that is, well, what were the Africans in the Caribbean thinking, what were the slaves thinking, and so that's why there's 2 volumes. And the second one, Blacks in Bondage, Blacks in Rebellion, sorry, was the one that really influenced me, because there was a lot of research, and what that said to me was that there are voices of Africans, from the past that spoke about their enslavement. So, the history that I was used to was told to me by white people who recorded things and, gave their perspective on what was going on, which is fine. But the perspective of black people sort of came home to me reading this book, that we could hear their voices, what they thought. When Sam Sharpe was executed in Montego Bay, he was interviewed by a Baptist minister called Henry Bleby, and he wrote down sort of word for word what Sam Sharpe was saying, and not just Sam Sharpe, his lieutenants and other people like that. And those are the perspectives that I really wanted to sort of roll out into this book, so we could hear our voices from the past talking about how we felt about our environment, and when I say environment, the political, the social, the economic and technological.
Because I guess in a sense of, if you don't write about yourself, then somebody else will write about you, and they're not going to probably do it in a correct manner. What kind of cultural value do you see in writing about African-inspired history?
Cultural value, well, I mean, we, as a black man, as an African Caribbean, as an African, we often hear about how civilization was formed and what have you. And so it's quite important that if we're going to encourage our young people and adults as well, I have to say, to be more confident, to be more have a more optimistic outlook on life, then they've got to be able to embrace themselves. They've got to embrace themselves, their history and who they are. And that goes for anybody else looking in on African history, black history. They've got to be able to understand where we're coming from in order to embrace us as a people. So it works both ways. And I think that's what researching, writing and sharing the information does. It enables people to understand and become more self-assured and increase self-esteem.
You've sort of answered to my next questions there, which is really good, but I kind of want to bring out sort of the last part of what we just spoke about, is how important do you think it is for non-Africans to be reading African authentic history? Okay.
Well, if non-Africans don't, there's a big push out there right now in the corporate world, and the push is about diversity. And what the world realizes is that we live in an economic environment as well as others, but I mean, in order to sell products, in order to to do business, you have to understand the people that you're dealing with. And African people from the African diaspora has touched everything out there, be it sport, be it business, be it commerce and what have you, be it culture as well. I mean, even the way people dress, they want to be part of that sort of African Caribbean thing. But if you don't understand our culture, it makes it very difficult to operate in that kind of environment. So, and that's really just talking about a business perspective, but it plays out in the political world as well, and the social, and where we're talking about social what's the word? Social history.
Yeah, and kind of racial self-esteem.
Self-esteem and so on. So that's where other cultures need to, to really understand what we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
And that's how when it comes to fashion, music and what have you, some people are left behind, they don't see what's coming down the road. That's because they don't really understand us.
Yeah.
So, we are a creative, we're inventive people. And if you're going to sort of like look to the future, you have to look to us. And that's usually the case, as I say, when you're talking about culture, trendsetters. Hey, that's what it's about.
So it's sort of like just bringing this short interview to an end. It's for you personally, when did you sort of realise the power of writing? What was your first experience personally in thinking, wow, this is, writing is powerful and it's had an impact on me?
Okay. I never started this journey wanting to be an author. That was the byproduct of the research that I did. But in order to, we suffered a lot of trauma during slavery, and in order to come to terms with that, the writing process, writing Ancestors, a novel, helped me through that. So I went through the whole journey of capture, of anger, of fear, of the violence and what have you, and I understood that. But as I was writing, my personality came out in wanting to reach to a positive end. And what I realized was that, the creative process helped me to understand the struggle, helped me to bring out the struggle, and helped me to understand how we overcame the struggle, what qualities we had, our strategic abilities, our communicative abilities, all these things came out and I think surfaces as we move towards the end of the book. So this isn't a book about trauma, this is a book about struggle and how we overcame that struggle. And I think that's what I'm about, struggle and how we overcome, and just maintaining a positive outlook to life.
And just generally in life, if you could give it the name of a book that just influenced you personally, whether it's with the subject you wrote about or just something in general.
The book that influenced me personally would be The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. And we happen to be in Hackney as it goes, but that's nothing to do with C.L.R. James, Black Jacobins. I think that's the book that really brought out my sort of ambition to preserve the history of the leaders of these freedom movements, the people who got us through to where we are today.
For anybody finally looking to look into the subject and theme of what you've written about and what you're going to be speaking about tonight, where would you suggest that they start?
Where would they start? I would always say sort of understanding African civilizations, and understanding Egypt, because that tells us about what, who we are and what our potential to contribute even further to society is. But then I would move on from that, and I would want to understand so how we got into the situation that we're in today, and only slavery explains that. And so I would encourage people to read books like Black Jacobins, Slaves Who Abolished Slavery, my book, as well as the books about African civilization to understand, the solutions to the problems.
Okay, I want to thank you. It's been a privilege meeting with you again, and I wanted to say, please give the names of your books again so people can buy them.
Okay, well, there's Ancestors, which is a novel, it's non-fiction, and A Tree Without Roots, the guide to researching African, British, and Asian, Caribbean ancestry.
Presumably available on Amazon and all good book retailers?
Absolutely, and if you come along to my talks, I'm happy to sign one for you.
There you go. Thank you very much.
Okay,
appreciate
thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thanks.